Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host Niels Eichhorn from, of course, rainy North Germany. I love how we always get this rainy weather in the spring, and you thankfully have a good rain jacket and everything. Otherwise, I would be soaked going to work and back. It's unpleasant, but I have a guest who doesn't have to worry about that, who would probably love to get the rain that I have, considering where they are located. And today I have a book that took me a long time to read because it was incredibly dense in the information it gave, incredible in the way it made me think, and it wasn't a page turner, but it was a page turner in your mind of like the things that were going on every page. So today we are going to talk about American Laughter, American Fury. Humor in the Making of the White Man's Democracy, 1750 to 1850, which came out with Johns Hopkins University Press. And my guest is Eran Zelnick, who is a lecturer in the Department of History at at California State University, Chico, with a PhD from the University of California, Davis. All right, got my two there almost mixed up there, the two systems. He has published a good number of articles, has published a few things in popular media. So, Oran, I'm very glad to have you on the podcast today and talk about your really interesting book.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so let's how do you come to write a book about humor that, not stated on the title page, but in your introduction, also deals with how humor and settler colonialism kind of create a certain identity in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a convoluted journey of sorts. I really started my PhD with thinking that I really need to understand the complexity of American democracy, and also with a avid interest in cultural history. And so, and I wanted to be a cultural historian. That's the type of history that always excited me the most. And so I started to just kind of immerse myself in a lot of, especially newspapers early on. I figured I wasn't sure exactly, but I wanted to understand kind of democratic culture. I was kind of influenced by, say, this idea, these Tocquevillian ideas about um, the the democratic nature of culture in the United States, and so etc. So I thought to kind of try to figure what that looked like, and so I started to read a lot of newspapers. And the one thing that quickly stood out to me is that there's a lot of humor, a lot of kind of jokes, a lot of non-serious stuff. That really intrigued me. I was, I remembered Robert Thornton's famous phrase that if there's a joke that you don't understand about a period, that's kind of one of the best, or if there's something that makes people from the period laugh, but not yourself, that's an exceptionally productive place to start off from. And so kind of I was like, humor sounds like an interesting thing to study. I went then to one of my professors, Alan Taylor, and I, told him I think I'm going to do humor, and he's like, "Yeah, sounds like as better than any idea you've come up with yet." So, um, so so I started looking into humor, and very quickly I found that there's a kind of interesting, a lot of threads going on and a lot of interesting stuff to look at. And it took me, a long time to figure out too that humor is kind of is also violent and has kind of this violent underbelly as well. I tended to view humor more of kind of as a positive way initially. but so, and with time, I just kind of gravitated more and more towards thinking actually humor is kind of excellent in especially examining the contradictory nature of the United States and how democracy and violence works together, because humor has both these capacities to both kind of bring people together in this joyful attitude, but also it ultimately has usually this type of violence built into it. Those who are not in on the joke, or worse yet, those who the joke is on. And so that turned out to be really excellent, exactly what I was looking for in terms of understanding American democracy. And also, as kind of a leftist, I always thought that I need to be critical too, because, of the United States. One reason I came to study the United States as a leftist, I felt like that's kind of the the head of the snake as far as capitalism in our modern world is concerned. So, I need to better understand it. And so it actually kind of worked really well. The next thing that really clicked for me is that when I realized that I'm originally from Israel, that actually there's a lot of similarities between Israel and the United States in terms of their history, in terms of their settler colonialism. Um, and that in the category of settler colonialism really intrigued me, especially from my perspective as kind of an insider to both settler colonial societies from a settler's perspective. And so I started to kind of find out that this humor also has um, resonance with this notion of settler colonialism, and I could bring my own kind of interesting, I hope, interesting perspective as somebody who has kind of a comparative lens as well, who has a certain sense about how I grew up in a different type of settler society, settler colonial society. Now I'm studying another settler colonial society, and so all this kind of meshed together very, very well for me, actually.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that because it's something that always intrigues me, and that I with a couple of people had frequent conversations about that. Obviously, I'm too. I came to the United States from Germany. I studied U.S. history and sort of thought about it in sort of a global perspective, kind of taking it out of parochial, nation-state centered narrative. So, do you feel that by as an outsider coming to the United States and then studying U.S. history, that gives you a less baggage imposed kind of lens?
I
Because like you didn't grow up with American exceptionalism constantly in your ear.
mhm,
You're coming to the country as the outsider that is not jaded by all of that. So
mhm.
this is
Yeah, I mean, I
that.
think that, to some degree, I have been a U.S. citizen for since I was 7. I lived in the United States for several years when I was little. My mom is American. I have grandparents, or I had grandparents who lived in the United States. So I was very familiar with the United States, and it was kind of my second um,
Mhm,
nationality. But still, I was an outsider. I'm still
mhm,
consider myself something of an outsider for sure. But I was an outsider who had a significant also amount of inside
mhm,
sense. And so I think that actually I think I'd like to hope that that's actually the exact kind of right
mhm,
amount of insider outsider perspective that allows me both to kind of have a certain intuitive sense of American society, but also a little bit of an outsider
yeah,
approach to it that allows me to kind of look at it, you know, with I hope is some kind of more analytical, or at least some different analytical perspective than maybe people who were raised in the United States. So yeah, I think that's my strength. I'd like to think that that's my strength for sure.
yeah. I think so, but I think some of our critics may not agree with that.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
you always have
Hmm.
critics.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
you already mentioned that, like when you started, humor was sort of something that we in contemporary times think of as it's funny. It,
Hmm.
it's a joke. We laugh about it. But you kind of illustrate that and indicated already that there's a darker side to humor. So
Hmm.
if I want to think of like say well, 1800 or 1810, what do I have to imagine when it comes to humor?
Well, first, I work off of a definition of humor that it turns out to me to be more productive for my
Mhm,
purposes, and that interestingly aligns quite well with the notions that contemporaries would have had of humor. For contemporaries, for English people, for Britons, as well as for uh, Americans in this era, um, humor would have meant kind of a just pretty generally positive um, sense of whimsy and sense
mhm,
of mirth and sense of um, being in good humor, right? That's kind
mhm,
of
yeah.
what still you might be able to say in English. You're
Mhm,
right, being in good humor, being in good cheer,
yeah.
having this pretty um, just a sunny disposition, and
Mhm,
so that's kind of what people at the time thought of humor meant, and it comes, of course, from the theory of humors,
mhm,
of the fact that there's four different types of liquids that organize our health and our disposition and our character as well, and auspicious combination of those humors allows for you to be in good health and in good cheer and in good humor. And so that's and that really works for me because humor to me is something that where it, at least it was more productive to think that way, is something that's more than just a joke, more than just funny, but more like fun, right? And so anything that creates the sense of fun and whimsy and the sense of um, good cheer and mirth. Mirth might be a one of the best words actually for it. Is what I was going for and what I was looking for, and what contemporaries would have understood as well. And so I was looking for any type of things that conveyed that type of sensibilities. So it could be, of course, jokes, which
mhm,
do that. And there was a lot of jokes at the time. There's a genre that's called jest books, and this genre was pretty popular in the English world, in the English speaking world. These collection of anecdotes that are funny. And these anecdotes are jokes, but are also just kind of funny anecdotes. Like you tell a friend something funny that happened to you, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be classically a joke.
mhm,
Um, but also stuff more broadly, play, and ultimately what I gravitated to over time more and more is the carnivalesque. And here, kind of, I was riffing off of works by many other scholars who have researched the carnivalesque, starting from Mikhail Bakhtin and many, many others. And so I found that the Americans had a lot of that going on, a lot of these type of this vein of the carnivalesque that comes from early modern and from pre-modern to European societies, and that Americans took to, and also Americans in ultimately in the United States. I argue they created it into also embedded it into their popular culture, which is, I argue, a different type of culture in that it's not something that's full culture. It's something that's created in the context of a nation state and in the context of a burgeoning capitalist nation state as well, for the purposes of consumption, right? For the purpose of selling and consuming humor. And so those type of things, and just to kind of to be specific, um, right, I talked about jest books, but I also talk about I start in the revolution about stuff like tarring and feathering, or rowdy mobs and rowdy crowds, or things like the Boston Tea Party when they dressed up as Mohawks to raid the ships, and they were very, very ebullient from all indications as they were doing it. And of course, the name of the Boston Tea Party itself is kind of a quip, a joke about the
mhm,
whole event.
mhm,
And so um, that is exactly what I was kind of looking for, these type of things With time, the song Yankee Doodle became especially central to my argument as well, and songs that are very ditties, you might call, that are they kind of have some whimsical, both in their lyrics but also in their music,
Mhm.
that allow you to dance or allow you to feel this kind of mirth, um, those type of things. Yeah.
So, just out of curiosity, why did you pick 1750 to 1850 as sort of your broad start to end point?
Um, yeah, so I was looking for this transformation,
Mhm,
or I was looking to tell a story, a certain type of story,
mhm,
and I was looking to tell a certain type of story about um, how a certain type of folk culture emerged in the
mhm,
United States that had included a lot of this type of folk humor, or humor. Um, and but and had a lot of democratic and anti-authoritarian qualities to it, but at the same time also developed these exclusionary and chauvinistic
mhm,
elements to it as well. And so, and ultimately, I wanted to end at a time in which the United States is fully has come to its own as a what I call a white man's democracy, in an extremely contradictory place.
mhm,
And I think there's no place, maybe, I mean, I might be hyperbolic here a bit, but I think that there might not be a more contradictory place in world history than antebellum United States, in that
mhm,
it was super committed to democratic ideas and sensibilities, but also it was carrying out ethnic cleansing. It was becoming the largest slave society in the world. Um, and it was, and it was also, included a lot of just
mhm,
chauvinistic
mhm,
attitudes of various sorts. And so I wanted to finish there. How did we get to that kind of society, and
mhm,
to plumb the origins of that in the early modern period? And 1750s was kind of a very, just kind of an easy, helpful place to begin with to tell that story. We start to get a decent amount of print materials after
mhm,
1750, so you can start to track this type of popular culture
mhm,
at that time. Also, that's the time in which the United States is starting to build up towards this, this imperial crisis with England, and so these type of dispositions also come into play. Yeah, so that's kind of how that cohered.
yeah. And there are a couple of moments where when I read your book and I kind of was like, "Ooh, this it continues on." So it's not it didn't feel like you hinted at it a few times, but you didn't explore it, which makes sense in the chronological kind of sense of the book. But it's like if you wanted to, there's things that continue on that where this is not it's not the end. It's just
Oh yeah.
there's a
Hmm.
next
I mean,
stage.
and in the epilogue, I pretty explicitly go way beyond 1850 and go
Right.
into the Reconstruction, and then try to connect it all the way to today. And I
Mhm.
even start with January 6th, 2021
Right.
in my introduction. So yeah, I do make some allusions, and I
Mhm.
argue that this is the formative period in
Mhm.
which this is coming into its own. But then once it's there, these threads continue, right? These type of traditions, and are with us to this day. Yeah,
Yeah. And I do have to say, like, I love some of your chapter titles. they're they're
thanks.
just amazing, right? When you're like alligator horses. I mean that immediately piques your interest, and you're like, what is that? So I commend you that you picked some really kind of eye-catchy kind of titles there to think about, or Tale of Two Clowns. Yeah, Tale of Two Clowns. Yeah, too. It just it had sort of a real. It's such a dense book, but it has so many fun pieces to it where you're kind of like you have to smile when you read it or you look
Uh-huh.
at
Yeah, and I hope to bring some kind of the to kind of explain the humor in it, and why
it.
that humor was captivating for
Mhm,
contemporaries, and how even though it's despicable in many ways, it's
mhm,
also, it's kind of a, how to walk this weird line. You want to convey the attraction of this humor and how it felt right to the readers, how it felt compelling and fun, even
Mhm,
though this was, of course, very violent. But
mhm,
that's the whole point, right? Of
mhm.
it was um, the fun and the violence were built in for a purpose.
Yeah. And it sort of, as I was reading it, I kind of often felt like it reads like it reads like the story of America, right? That it's not just like when you sometimes pick up a cultural history of like the antebellum or the early republic, and it's like it's a snippet of something, it's a small piece, but you're never limited in any shape or form. You're national in everything you're doing. You're looking at the whole country, whether it's Western frontier connects back to New England or south to north. And it did you kind of envision this as sort of a national history? And as a
Hmm.
follow-up, I'll immediately shoot that to you. How should we, like, based on your book, um, how should we rethink the history of the
Hmm.
United States?
Yeah, so I actually did it very purposefully as a national history, because I was very attracted in my formative period as a uh, undergraduate student and in a PhD student with early American studies
Hmm.
books,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
what the so-called uh, the what's it called, the myth and forgetting the name. There's a whole kind of vein of literature like books like Virgin Land,
Mm,
and
yeah.
books like
American myth. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and books like
Versus yeah.
Slotskin's trilogy,
Hmm.
especially Regeneration Through Violence, and right,
Hmm.
and what's the second one? I forget, but The Fatal Environment, maybe. Yeah, and those type of books that really were kind of conceptualized on a net and were more took a more literary approach and a more of American studies approach, which I knew was not very popular
Hmm.
within in history at the time, and I was kind of becoming a bit frustrated by all what I sometimes call the atomization of American
Hmm.
history. This attempts to complicate it. This attempt
Hmm.
to just sit with the complexity of it and to imagine all kinds of different outcomes, and to to say like, yes, the United States could expanded westward in a certain way, but it could have happened in a variety of different ways. All kinds of different things could have happened, and I think there's significance to that, but I felt like that was overdone a bit, and we've lost a bit an ability to simplify,
Hmm.
which I think is ultimately what um, the most important thing that is an historian can do, right?
Hmm.
In the end of the day, we are simplifiers, right? The historical past is chaotic, and you're trying to find patterns and simplify them. And I think that the best thing one can do is ultimately try to find
Hmm.
something that is a relatively simple story, but that still is able to um, help explain a lot. And so that's what I was looking most to do, to go back to that type of histories that were um, kind of try to tell a relatively simple narrative that has a lot of explanatory power.
Hmm.
Um, and because that's what I felt like was missing at the from the historiography as I was as it was shaping up at the time, and what I wanted to add to it, and maybe take it back a little bit to where it used to be. Of
Hmm.
course, that's a bit of a lofty goal, but nevertheless, that's one that that's kind of how I think one should act as an historian, try to kind of you know make some kind of dent,
Hmm.
ideally, right, in the way things are going. And so that's
And
what, yeah,
dare say you're swinging a big pole in trying to
yeah,
make that in the way
yeah,
you're in the things
yeah.
that you're asking us to think about. So I think that's a great
Hmm.
approach. With your book, you picked and explained that briefly, I think, in the introduction, that you picked the title purposefully with American Laughter, American Fury, leaning on um, another very important historical book, American Slavery, American Freedom. So
Right.
why did you why like your two books are very different areas that you're looking at, very different kind of approaches, but why did you feel like you wanted to kind of lean
hmm
on um, this previous scholarship's title with your title?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I felt like that Edmund Morgan, in his classic, he called on historians to deal with this paradox,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And when I read it, that's one of the things that influenced me in, I felt called upon, right? And so I feel like I'm trying to do what Edmund Morgan urged us to do, and
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly kind of where my book is headed, and kind of fleshing out,
Mm-hmm.
continuing to flesh out that the paradox of American history, how American history is embodies this contradiction, and so I really. And so actually initially my book title was Republic of Mirth. Um,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I think a new title's better.
But then when I talked to people, first, a lot of people didn't know what mirth was exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, it was actually one of my readers, David Wallstreicher,
Mm-hmm.
who recommended, said, look, you're also trying to tell something about the United States in general. That's ultimately what you're trying to say, something about the
Mm-hmm.
character of America. And so
Mm-hmm.
that book, your book should convey that, that that you're articulating something about the character of America. And so I thought that was a good point. And so I tried to think about what I'm saying about America. I'm saying America is a contradictory place that
Mm-hmm.
embodies violence and humor in this way. And so um, at first I went with I asked my wife, I was asked her, how about riffing off of the Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury,
Oh.
um, the what was the original? It was something like the Laughter and the Fury.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, I think that's a bit too, you know, kind of a bit too much, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so, and then, but ultimately, it came down to American Laughter, American Fury. I felt like that was, a bit of a riff on the Sound and the Fury, but especially a riff on the on American freedom, American slavery.
No, it's a nice title. I like it. It's
Thanks.
and,
Yeah.
and it makes you sing. That's
Yeah.
that's a big one too. So now we've talked about the kind of book in general, sort of towards the last half hour. So it's time that we get into the book a little bit and kind of
hmm
gives people sort of a good sense of things that you cover. And there's just for the listeners, there's no way we can cover this book. like even 3 hours, I don't think we would be able to even scratch the surface with all the stories that Aran has put into them. So make sure you get the book because it is so many. There's so much fascinating detail in there. Um, but you start with like the revolutionary period, and um, in part something that I immediately kind of picked up on was sort of some of the carryovers from Europe. Like you have sort of the maypole that becomes a liberty pole, or the um, what's it called? These kind of anti-Catholic events in Britain that lead to Pope Day in
hmm
the colonies. So, how do you feel like in the colonies there is sort of obviously they're still British. There's a lot of interaction with the British, but how much does British humor, British personality influences the way the colonies act, embrace
hmm
humor, and
hmm Yeah, I mean, I
so on?
think yeah, there's certainly a ton of continuity.
Mm.
Um, and ultimately, I'm talking about folk culture, and I dealt some with kind of the theory of folk culture and thinking about the nature of folk culture. And folk culture is something that coheres over decades and generations. And it's something that's very mysterious, really. We don't know that much about it, because
Mhm.
it's predominantly comes from oral cultures. When we only get glimpses, then we have to kind of try to construct it as best we
Mhm.
can. And so, first of all, I always enjoyed those type of stories about folk culture and right, this attempt to reconstruct them. Alfred Young is one of my favorite historians, and his kind of work with early folk cultures and their continuity from England was always one of my favorites. So I really gravitated to that, and I also thought that there's a lot of a kind of it has to be part of the story, an important starting point for the story, because ultimately, right, these settlers, and this is, they come with a whole baggage,
Mhm.
but then the whole idea of settler colonialism is that you have these settlers come from with a European baggage, and are coming to this place, and that it has a completely different set of circumstances, and so they have to innovate, and so they apply European formulas to these new surroundings and challenges as they create a new type of folk culture that emerges in the colonies. And so I felt that that has to be the beginning of the story in order to establish, where these traditions start.
Mhm.
And also, I always was attracted to this idea that European folk culture had a lot of subversive elements
Mhm.
to them. I've kind of really enjoyed. I've always enjoyed these E.P. Thompson, and
Mhm.
those type of scholars who traced um, the right, the subversive nature of pre-modern European folk culture, and how it emerged as a sort of a kind of a counter hegemony of sorts to the leading right, hegemons of the time. And so I thought that also has to, you know, there has to be continuity here. If the United States developed a subversive culture, as a settler colonial society, then that's the apt place to start.
Right. No, no, it's interesting because there is just that they're not that far removed yet, right? And that's I
Totally,
think
yeah.
part of that story. And you already mentioned tarring and feathering too, and
hmm
it's I mean you don't go into you go into some of the details about what happens with the tars, the feathers, but then the key part for you is sort of that the laughter, that the humor that this invokes, and it's a dark humor, right? The
hmm
pain, the suffering of somebody else is
hmm
making me laugh.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right. It's this community event that comes from pre-modern societies, in which, pre-modern societies created all kinds of rituals
Mhm.
of policing their communities, and policing all kinds of things that they, thought were in need of community intervention in a variety of different ways, and they did it through the spectacle of humor, right?
Mhm.
And that's exactly where that tarring and feathering comes out of. And the idea is that the community comes together and rejoices in kind of this spectacle as it makes fun of a certain member of the community, usually who's being pilloried in some ways, or in this case, carried around as a rooster, even as pain is inflicted to them.
Mhm.
And people are drinking, and people are laughing, and and people are enjoying themselves.
Mhm.
And I think that that has a lot of, that kind of stuff is part of a lot of subversive moments in history, right? I mean, most revolutions, right, have these type of moments, ebullient moments, where you cherish the downfall of the high and mighty, or you cherish, their pain. And so that's right. That's kind of what tarring and feathering is in many ways about.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it really reminded me of some of the scenes that I've shown to my even recently to my students in the IB with civil rights or lynchings, right? Like here's
hmm
this incident of like here's a picture of this black kid hanging off the tree limb with a noose around their head, and you have this festive feel of the group below
Right.
it. is
Right.
enjoying that, and you're kind of like,
Right.
what's wrong with you? You know.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah.
Well, let I let you answer for, or kind of put your 2 cents in there first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's an important thing to come to terms with, the fact that humans are attracted to,
Mm-hmm.
to that type of,
Mm-hmm.
darkness. That's something that humans enjoy. That's what
Mm-hmm.
and people have always enjoyed this type of thing. Um, and it's just something that we have to come to terms with when we think about humor and its nature, is including in American history, and maybe especially even in American history.
Wow, we're going down a rabbit hole now, but like when you were talking, and like this is like really kind of strikes a little too close to the heart probably here, but it reminded me of Christopher Browning's book on ordinary man with regards to the Holocaust, right? Of like
Hmm.
the arguments that he comes up with, that anyone could commit atrocities, right? That
Hmm.
you're speaking
Right.
to something that's very deep in human nature, is that under the right circumstances, we all laugh at the person that
Hmm.
tripped. We
Right.
all laugh at
I
the
mean, look at the United States right now. I think that
mm,
I actually think that one way to understand Trump is that to understand it as a prank of
mm,
sorts, kind of riffing
right,
off my book. It's a
right.
prank of the
Mm,
right, right? They know that this person is exactly who liberals hate. And what better
mm,
way to troll liberals than to
yeah.
have this person around who's just um, kind of bumbling into every liberal
Mm,
piety and just completely tearing it apart. That's the kind of
mm,
mirth I'm talking about, right? To them, that's he's kind of, and so it's still very much around, of course.
yeah. Yeah, no, and like like I have kids. Kids are cruel.
Hmm.
Like there's things where like they make fun of things. You're kind of like, "Ah, you shouldn't do that," but
Hmm.
then you see the adults that don't do anything, and you're kind of like, yep. And there's a
Yeah.
problem with society right there. Um, um, but I think the other part that I want to get to is with your book is that you, in these early chapters, you draw a line between the sort of gentlemanly humor and the humor of commoners, right? So like,
Hmm.
how do you feel like what's the distinguishing factor between sort of like the, the humor that the average person versus a more socially upper scale person
Uh-huh.
would embrace?
Yeah. I mean, what I found is that the humor can work in a kind of in several different ways, and you really humor can work in a ton of ways. It's like there's a understanding humor is something that there's a kind of nobody's fully been able to do, kind of fully understand or
Mm-hmm.
fully kind of, because it's so multifaceted. But at least the ones that seem to interest me is the way humor creates certain types of communities,
Mm-hmm.
and creates a certain, and especially with regard to class, right, is
Mm-hmm.
it allows for certain types of class consciousness and class formation,
Mm-hmm.
in both, in the United States. What I found is that ultimately this kind of self-deprecating humor, um, as Americans were kind of laughing at their boorishness and laughing at the fact that they are, kind of bumpkins, is right. And that's where the song Yankee Doodle comes into play, which is basically it's a celebration of the United of Americans as bumpkins. And it becomes this joke that only bumpkins can really be in on, right? And it's kind of this self-deprecating joke. And if you're, and you can still see threads to this day in redneck humor, right? There's
Yeah.
these kind of humor, kind of comics who talked about, would like to, in front of other working class or, uh, you know, people who think of themselves as working class white folks. They tell jokes about, how big of a redneck I am, or
Mm-hmm.
how I'm married to my cousin, or and that's
Pedro and
and
Thibodeau jokes in Louisiana.
right. Right, exactly. Um, and so that's exactly the kind of thing that, I argue is part of this um, formation of the United States as a self-conscious nation of
Mm-hmm.
commoners. right? And so it creates this class consciousness as a nation of commoners through this mode of self-deprecation. It was a very generative type of humor for that type of for that to cohere. What I have also found is that there's other types of elitist communities, and still to this day we still find that as well. That and that usually tends to be the humor more associated with elites and middle classes, is that they try to bring to distinguish themselves from the lower sort, from the commoners, from the crasser sort, through humor that is condescending, through humor that is um, elitist in a variety of different ways, that tries to basically create. And they're the people who are in on the joke, or the people who are not commoners, or people who are elites, and laugh at the fact that these people are crass, they're buffoonish, they are illiterate, they are what have you. And so, yeah, so I found this kind of as a very useful vein of humor that in the United States was kind of were dueling it out early on. What I argue is that ultimately the humor of the commoners won out big time in the United States, and sure, there's still and still is elitist humor in the United States, but right, the one that has more traction, and the one that is feels ultimately more compelling from a nationalist standpoint, still tends to be that kind of humor of commoners, that self-deprecating humor, that is also right, that also kind of, I argue, spills into this humor of making fun of people of color or playing Indian as well. Yeah, and so that's that was really the toughest part of my book, to prove that there's a connection between those two modes of humor. That was right, this kind of anti-authoritarian, self-deprecating humor, and that racist humor, that these actually were of right of a piece with each other. And so yeah, so that's what I hope. I've always, from the beginning, I was aware that that's going to be kind of the crucial thing to try and prove. And I hope that I was able to do it. But I do understand that maybe some people will not, not be, uh, might not buy it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of reminded me where you were talking of like the sort of New York's theater district, right? Like the
Hmm.
Broadway higher class theaters versus Bowery working class theaters, the more boorish, rude, crudeness of humor and
Right.
productions, the things they're putting on
Right.
versus
Hmm.
kind of refined that the elite on Broadway would see, right?
Hmm. Right.
It's in so many different places during this period, but then
Hmm.
also the decades after is that you see that.
Hmm. Right. I mean, and blackface minstrelsy, especially, right, is the
Mhm,
ultimate example of a humor that's boorish, crass.
mhm,
It's a humor of the commoners, and but ultimately, the most important work it does is racial,
mhm,
and that's kind of it's anti-elitist to a degree, and as well, but it's really first and foremost a racist form of humor, and really it brings together these two threads, but it also showcases the ways in which, the most important thing that this humor ultimately has done in American history. Yes, it kind of created a subversive edge, um, but it also at the same time embraced this very chauvinistic and almost kind of gleefulness at violence,
mhm.
um, that that has been part of towards racial others.
Yeah, and the other part that when I was reading your book, it's sort of when I read the section on the Boston Tea Party, right? And you very conscientiously talk about how this is an elite event. The elite is in control of things. There's the living. We can talk about the gimmick on the Native American dressing up, the
Hmm.
theatrics of that, but it very much reminded me of I taught briefly a little bit on the memory of that and how
Hmm.
when the centennial rolls around, the Boston Tea Party is commemorated because it's elite Bostonians determining it was a good event. We were in charge. It was us directing it, so we're going to celebrate it. Boston
Hmm.
Massacre. It was a masses. It was commoners. We're not going to
Hmm.
celebrate that. Of course, we don't want to celebrate commoners rising up to overthrow the elite, right? And it
Right.
seems
Right.
that seems that you're looking at with the Boston Tea Party is something that continues on with sort of this the elite wanting to sort of imprint itself on
Hmm.
society.
Right. And it's part of my attempt to suggest that what I'm doing here is not merely just, you know, dissing on lower class folks and how
Right.
awful they are, right? But also that actually suggests that this is part of a structure.
Mhm.
It's a structure that has to do, and perhaps even starts with the elites, right? The elites are the ones who first try to distinguish themselves from the masses,
Mhm.
from right, and to have more power, and kind of the masses and the commoners kind of cohere their own style, but nobody does it really because they are, necessarily worse than anybody or better, or it's just a part of a set of historical circumstances and set of structures that I hope, right, like, because another thing that I was really trying to walk a fine line of is first, I found very unsatisfying this traditional approach that lower class people are simpletons that are being deluded by elites into racism, or this kind of classic, and it comes through in in American slavery, American freedom, the sense that lower class people were bought off by the wages of whiteness, by elites. And I was unsatisfied. I'm unsatisfied. I don't like or I don't fully agree with the kind of Marxist idea of false consciousness.
Mhm.
I think that is it's kind of it's condescending. It's to suggest that somehow there's these people who are being completely manipulated. I think there's something there, and I think you have to come to terms with these type of dynamics. But I think
Mhm.
that ultimately you have to also regard people as making their choices, and they make their choices because ultimately there is something attractive to be psychologically superior, to be part of a caste system in which you're superior, and that's just could be just as attractive as material benefits, and we need to come to terms with the fact that it is attractive. We can't just kind of say that it's not attractive really. As in that regard, I'm not a Marxist, I suppose, or at least a traditional one. And so I I was uncomfortable with that talking point, but I was also uncomfortable with just kind of dissing on lower class people, because I think that that's not the story here. The story here is also a story made by elites as well. Elites are, this is kind of a structure that is a result of both elites and lower class people as they duel with each other culturally, politically, and economically.
Mhm. Yeah, no, and I think that's sort of a very important point because there's a lot of people in that could see themselves in the books that feel maybe uncomfortable with some of the things that are being said. But I think that's important to kind of consider is that you are holding up a mirror for us to kind of
Hmm.
look very critically at us or at people in the United States to very critically look at themselves and say there's been fundamentally something that has been going on that we might need to change or should consider
Hmm.
change.
Hmm. Right. And I think to some degree, that's why I also find myself uncomfortable sometimes with the humor of elites today,
Mhm.
say liberal humor, that this is
Right.
on kind of, makes fun of lower class people,
Mhm.
white people, and how, I think that's not productive. It's
Mhm.
you're just feeding the cycle. You're just feeding this, the structure that has created the type of place the United States is. Um, yeah.
No, I agree. It's like I had individuals who very much sort of live in the ivory tower, and you're kind of like, no, this. If you don't understand, if you basically just right, like since we brought modern politics into this, like if you just diss and say, oh, because you're a Trump voter, you're stupid. I'm not going to engage with you.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
counterproductive. how do
Hmm.
we change the society? How do we change things if we don't want to listen to the grievances that people have?
Hmm. Yeah. Totally.
Unpopular opinion, but I think
Yeah.
that's
Hmm.
a key part of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of complicity for
Hmm.
middle class liberal elites in American history in all these structures and creating them. Um, and they're no less part of the story as lower class people. I think that's kind of the interesting kind of the dynamic, this kind of the structural dynamic here between middle class
Hmm.
culture, lower class culture, middle class economic, socially speaking, that creates the dynamic that is the United States, and elites may, in some ways, are even more significant to it because of their relative power and relative influence.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. Uh, let's turn a little bit to the frontiers because the frontiers are a really significant part of what you do, what you talk about, what the book is about. Because there's a lot of theatrics is
Hmm.
that you talk
Right.
about with the frontiers, and I like I guess the Boston Tea Party is a great example in this, right? It's this sort of the civilized European dresses up like a native person to throw tea over, or I dress
Hmm.
up as a Native American and I can go out and act as a guerrilla and as an uncivilized warrior on the frontiers and
Hmm.
fight.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. The frontier I think, is the, and here kind of, I also kind of wanted to intervene. A lot of people think that we should kind of ditch completely the frontier thesis, right? This idea that the frontier is a formative place for the
Mhm,
creation of the American character. And my argument is, yes, it is a formative place for the creation of American character, um, and but it created these type of, uh, violent and
mhm,
uh,
mhm,
this combination of laughter and fury, perhaps more than any other place.
mhm,
And if not the frontier itself, then the frontier in imagination as well, which I think is also important to note, that this is the frontier is in people's imagination just as much as it's real, in terms of its influence on people's lives, and on their makeup, right, on their cultural and makeup. And so, right, the frontier is this space in which people become, um, enact these, um, various types of fantasies, various types of ideas. Now, the what I ultimately try to argue is, to this day, this idea of the frontier is a place without inhibitions, right?
mhm,
It's a place where, if you're a white man,
mhm,
it's the ultimate place to be uninhibited, to act with impunity,
mhm,
to be gleefully uninhibited, right? To let your id come out with no kind of super ego to check it in.
mhm,
And so the frontier to this day, or kind of the great outdoors to this day, for white men especially, acts as that type of space, um, and it was developed as this type of productive space for kind of this ultimate sense of gleefulness and acting with impunity that white men have been attracted to, and have made it that kind of one of the bedrocks of their understanding of themselves as a nation. And that's something that, right, and that means, as a white person, you can be wear the bodies of others, and you can do whatever you want to do. You can shoot and kill and, um, be gleeful at it. You can masquerade. And all of this is, I argue, kind of a product of, right,
mhm,
these type of, these early attempts to merge these things together by frontiersmen, by militiamen,
mhm,
as they dressed up as Indians and went to fight Indians, in
mhm,
order to allay their own anxieties. But ultimately, it was also part of this transformative
mhm.
process of transforming the landscape itself, transforming themselves into indigenous people, um, that are at one with the landscape in which they're in.
Yeah, and I want to stick with the militia briefly because one of the things you
Mhm.
point out that the militia was very much theatric. Exactly.
Mhm.
They're parading around, they're drilling, but there wasn't much teeth behind some of this.
Right. I mean, the militia is a weird thing in American history, which I think we haven't really fully plumbed and come to terms with its significance. It's a formative institution,
Mhm,
both in people's ideologically, right? Just to think of Republican ideology and the significance it has for the militia as kind of the definitive kind of place in which men become citizens of the Republic. Um, and also this idea that the Republic ultimately should not have a standing army and the militia should, right? That's kind of the safeguard of virtue and the safeguard of um, the Republic. So ideologically, this is a very important idea. But in practice, it's also a very important institution in a variety of different ways. And of course, to fight, but no
mhm,
less importantly, also to come together in some various forms of camaraderie, various forms of play. Um, and it's also an institution that tries to assert hierarchies, but it's also
mhm,
an institution in which people try to undermine hierarchies. So also a site of conflict between elites and commoners. Um, so I think this is a very generative space, both in reality and in imagination, and in ideology, that we really ought to explore a bit more. And I thought to do some of it, certainly not exhaustively, but I really found it to be a really interesting line of inquiry, the militia, because it's so significant in American history. And to this day, right, I think that a lot of, I mean, I have here, not, we're in the North State here, we have the Cottonwood Militia next to me. There are a bunch of people who are self-styled militiamen who march around with guns and are big Second Amendment folks, and a few of them went to January 6th, 2021,
mhm.
with their militia gear.
Yeah.
Um, and so, these type of things are very much still around.
And I mean, this is where you can draw this long line, right? Like it's a
Right.
theatric of
Hmm.
if is this militia actually going to do anything if
Right.
they go up against a professional soldier?
Right.
No, no, they have no chance. But it's
Yeah.
just
It's
it
often
it.
theatrics today, and at the time it was theatrics, but at the time it was often also, it was kind of this weird thing. It could be theatrical, and in some
Mm,
people it was only theatrical, but some of the time, of course, it was super violent and
right,
very, very real. And the militia was all kinds of things in all kinds of different moments. It was just this
mhm,
very malleable
right,
entity that could appear in a variety of different ways. And there's really kind of, it's hard to talk about it as one institution, really, because it just appears in so many different calibrations, and including today. A lot of it is just spectacle, but then there's
mhm,
also a ton of real violence that happens,
mhm,
and it's hard
mhm,
to know when that spectacle is just going to stop short of spectacle and not be violent. But
right,
then but then sometimes it does turn into extreme violence pretty quickly and easily, and sometimes it doesn't. And
mhm,
and I think I think it's at many points it's worthwhile to try to figure out why at times it doesn't turn into violence and at other times it does. I argue that oftentimes it's racially, right? When there are actually racial others out there, it's far more likely to turn into extreme violence than, say, when it's I don't know, the whiskey rebels or the
right.
against the Eastern establishment.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's like the earlier republic has a few instances like the Whiskey Rebellion and the what's it called here, the Gnadenhutten massacre
Hmm.
that you
Right.
have looked at like these these moment of frontier extreme frontier violence because right this is
Hmm.
there's massacres on the frontiers and
Right.
it's again um very theatrical. It's elaborate in the way it's like they're not just shooting them in a battle. They're they're murdering people.
Hmm. Right. And they took a democratic vote
Hmm.
to decide what to do with them, and decided to
Right.
murder them. And they are self-styled democratic men who choose their
Hmm.
own commanders.
Hmm.
And as militia, they're very, very clear about the fact that they are free men who are will not abide by having kind of commanders imposed on them, foisted on them from above. So they were very committed to genuinely committed to democratic impulses, even as they carry out this intense massacre. And I find continuity between it's the same militia who committed the Gannat massacre and the ones that was at the center of the Whiskey Rebellion. So there's, it's the Washington County
Mhm.
militia. Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels like when we like you have this. I think it's in the book that this notion of the invincibility of the citizen soldier, and it
Mhm.
feels like that's such a beautiful American mythological tool, right? Like the American always wins. The American soldier always comes out on top.
Yeah.
And many times it is. Obviously, we have cases like Vietnam where that's not the case, but it's sort of like it. And there's moments where it's like, yeah, you came out on top, but at what cost, too? Like
Mhm.
it feels like the frontier lends itself to this myth-making, and this myth of the frontier has kind of made itself felt all over the United States, not just anymore in that kind of historic space.
Right. Right. And you know, uh, I think that one of the what I argue is one of the generative moments for this is, of course, Lexington and Concord,
Hmm.
right? The
Yeah.
battles of Lexington and Concord, which played out exactly according to the way Americans or Republican ideology of the militia wanted it to play out, right? Because it was these citizen soldiers that came out and defeated a
Mhm.
standing army that was standing in Boston at the time and was oppressing the good free people of the colony. And so this played out. So this is why the battle has been such a generative moment for Americans over the years. And to this day, I'd argue that a lot of people understand themselves through Lexington and Concord, right? A lot of people understand their role in the nation, right? These militiamen here at Cottonwood, they understand their
Mhm.
place in the nation through Lexington and Concord. In their minds, they're waiting for another Lexington and Concord, right? For another call to arms and to come out of the woodwork. They're waiting for Paul Revere, right? To
Yeah.
to basically tell them to come out and for many of them, January 6th, 2021 was kind of, they understood it through that lens.
Yeah. Yeah. It's scary to think that, but
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a somewhat of that.
They have a lot of guns. Yeah. So it's pretty scary.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. The like there's so many things that, and I'm just looking at the time. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many things we could still talk about, and we have so little time. But I really enjoyed also, like, in sort of a strange sense, right? You kind of note that Fenimore Cooper, with sort of this rescuing of women in, I think it was leather stockings,
Hmm.
this sort of like, he creates a genre for the United
Hmm.
States on frontier, this frontier fear of like this barbaric native that steals white women. And like I taught a course a few times at National University on film, and the Searchers is always in there, right? And exactly that Fenimore Cooper narrative of, and I feel like there's sort of, you set the stage where this emerges, but it's again, it's this long lasting fear that leads to extreme violence. And
Yeah. I mean, and here I've been influenced some by the work of Honor Sachs and her. And she wrote a little bit about the frontier and Daniel Boone and that myth, and
Mhm.
by Richard Slotkin in his writing on Cooper and the frontier, and that kind of myth of the white man rescuing the white woman who was taken away by savages, and how that's such a formative story to understanding the national community, right? it's always kind of white men defending white women from racial marauders is basically the kind of the most kind of long-standing, or one of the most long-standing formulas for
Yeah.
kind of understanding the nature of the national community. The the mobilized people of the national community, the citizens are the men, white men. The people to be kind of defended are white women who are not really kind of part of, they're kind of in the background, they're to be defended. And then the racial others are the people against the enemies of the national community that you have to defend. Yeah.
And that led to lynchings in the South, right?
Right.
It led to massacres
Right.
in was Native American communities, Asian
Right.
communities. It's incredible
Yeah, and
how
you can
powerful.
see the same thing in the War of 1812, right, where the work of Nicole Eustace, for example, recently, and I kind of was influenced by in my analysis of it, of how like this idea of beauty and booty
Mm,
became the calling cry of the or at least that was kind of the Americans pretend made up a story in which that was the supposed to be the calling cry of um, black runaway soldiers who ran away to the British Army and were seduced by the British uh, to participate in the Battle of New Orleans in order to gain the beauty and booty of New Orleans, in order to rape the women of New Orleans and to gain and to pillage New Orleans. And so, how that myth has become integral to Americans' understanding of the War of 1812. And there too, the Battle of New Orleans played out along those lines of these white men, these militiamen from Kentucky and Tennessee, coming to rescue the women of New Orleans from these black marauders.
And since we're on Tennessee, it's a perfect segue over to Davy Crockett, I think, because that's
Hmm.
another figure that you highlight extensively in the book in various places of how he 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 represents the frontier. He has this violent death in the
Hmm.
Alamo, but he's very much a figure that in various ways then becomes a theatrical
Hmm.
figure for the country.
Right. He
With
becomes kind of an iconic figure through which white men, especially common white men, understand themselves and give kind of live vicariously
Mhm,
this life of extreme unimpunity, extreme uninhibited unimpunity in the West, which is, as we already kind of discussed, so central um, to American sense of self, an
mhm,
American self of what it is to be free in America. To be free is to be giddy and uninhibited in the West and out in the great outdoors. That's kind of the ultimate kind of conceptualization of freedom.
yeah, and it's there's the historical figure, right? And then you have these
Right,
almanac figures that just
right,
like, where
right.
did
And the
that
almanac
story come
figures
from? I never
are
knew
the one
that.
that yeah, are the one that most obviously embody it far more than Davy Crockett himself, right? Because they just become more and more racy and racist, and more just unhinged in kind of what's going on there, and the type of
Mhm,
capabilities that Davy Crockett can, at some point he starts shooting lightning from his eyes, and he rides animals to battle, and
mhm,
you know but it's also a bit self-deprecating at the same time, as in that kind of mode of self-deprecation. It's just, so it's kind of, yeah, it's a fascinating, I think, genre, the Davy Crockett comic almanacs. And I
mhm,
think they're so formative in terms of creating that myth of Davy Crockett and creating that right, that kind of type of sensibility that is still with us, of kind of white male, um, combination of self-deprecating kind of
mhm,
boorishness alongside this feeling of being free, to commit whatever acts of violence one feels like they need to in the West, and the United States is the perfect landscape for those type of escapades.
Yeah, and you use an interesting wording there because you kind of ask the reader to think of whether David Crockett is sort of a patron saint or a jester, and
Hmm.
like totally different worlds, right? Like whether you're a
Right,
patron saint or a jester, but you kind of
right,
you see both in David Crockett.
right. He's a weird, yeah, he's a weird hybrid of being, a jester, patron saint, or some kind of superhero, right? Superman type of. But then also he's comical, including at himself. You laugh at him as
Mhm.
well. He's maybe one person I think you 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 might appreciate it more than most. Suggested he's a hybrid between Hercules and the Baron Munchausen. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, uh,
I had to explain my wife who that is, by the way, one time. she
okay.
she did not quite know that part of German culture yet.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that's pretty apt. Kind of this weird hybrid that comes from very different, kind of you don't. It's kind of not something that you expect to find.
Yeah, but it sort of when I read that, and even more so as we're talking, it did remind me a lot of Fess Parker's presentation of Davy Crockett in those Disney movies, right? That
Uh-huh.
he kind of presents himself as sort of the hero of the frontier, but there's constantly these moments where it's like the audience was laughing at the slapstick humor and the
Hmm.
slapstick attitude, or these just the way they're falling, the way they're just stupid
Hmm.
acting. That
Right.
and
Yeah.
it speaks again to like how
Right.
long lived it is.
Right. And I think you can still see that, say, in the '80s Dukes of Hazzard
Yeah.
shows,
Hmm.
right? These type of
Hmm.
people who are like, kind of doing are kind of some kind of weird combo of criminals or low level criminals, but also local heroes that get away with all kinds of stuff, and they do it with impunity. And of course, it's all in good fun, and they don't get into too much trouble ultimately. And they also have a Confederate flag on their car, so
Yeah, there's that.
yeah.
um, and it's I think you threw his name in once in all of that, but David Crockett so reminded me also of and things that the way his story kind of pans out, right? So he's the historical figures, the almanacs, and then sort of him in Congress, like sort of
Hmm.
the public figures that he is. But it so reminded me of Buffalo Bill too,
Uh-huh. Right.
William
Yeah.
Cody, like
And yeah,
these
and
sort of guys.
I really I loved Louis Warren's book on Buffalo Bill. I think Louis Warren is one of the best cultural historians we have in the United States today. And his book on Buffalo Bill, and also his recent book, God's Red Sun. I think they're great cultural histories. So I was, yes, very much influenced by his kind of, that mythology of
Mhm,
Buffalo Bill, and how it's a weird hybrid between truth and myth, and
mhm.
disentangling it is it's
Right.
interesting, but you can only do to a point. At some point, it's just kind of dissolves into, and it doesn't ultimately matter that much, because that's not the point, interrogating too much. What's the difference? And people know that too, that's it's all kind of larger than life, and it's a lot of it is not true. But yeah.
I have to look now. I think, yeah, I read that book. Yeah, it's right over there.
Mhm.
And I think I based my some of my American West lectures on that one. But
Oh,
it
yeah.
was very fascinating in the way he sings off to the the way East Coasters or even Europeans absorbs the American West as a space that they're fascinated by,
Hmm.
but they're not ever going to go to. Right?
Right.
This is sort of
Right.
like
Hmm.
and they kind of absorb the violence. They love sort of that clash of civilization that is that's part
Right.
of it. And
Right.
having watched some videos from those shows, again they were laughing at some of those things that were
Hmm.
going on.
Right. Yeah. No, It's yeah. If you haven't, for those who haven't read it, Buffalo Bills America. It's a great cultural history. If you like cultural history like me, that's will eat it up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a little time, so I think we should also talk a little bit about. I guess let's start with the idea of the black trickster.
hmm Yeah. So the right the last two chapters of my book deal a lot with the black trickster, the black minstrel. Um, and here, I mean, I thought to kind of both integrate him into the long history of American kind of humor and demonstrate that ultimately this is the ultimate embodiment of this hybrid. On the one hand, some sense of common man,
Mhm.
a commoner's humor, but ultimately it's a commoner's humor that is extremely racist and extremely works for the purpose of policing the borders of the nation around whiteness.
Mhm.
Um, and so that and it really offered me kind of a great way to bring that thing together and to demonstrate that these things are of a piece. um, but I also had another kind of bit of an axe to grind there in that I felt that a lot of studies of blackface minstrelsy have been way too sentimental and have overly appreciated the anti-authoritarian and anti-elitist nature of blackface minstrelsy
Mhm.
over the racist aspect of it, at least according to many in the origins of the genre, because they think of it as kind of a folk genre, and many of them have this sentimentalism of folk culture, and so they think that this is actually an origin. It was a kind of a positive thing. It was kind of the actually it facilitated this multiracial working class and some kind of sentimentalism of an appearance of a multiracial era in New York City. But I completely disagree with this. I think that there were multiracial, because there were moments in which races kind of came together and even enjoyed culture together, but there are far more moments in which they were antagonistic to each other and even violent, especially white people towards black people in American history. And we really should reorient our understanding of the genre around understand. Yes, humor does a lot of things at the same time, and every humor does a lot of things at the same time. I mean, for example, I can tell you a joke right now, and there's many layers usually to a joke, and it does a bunch of different things potentially. But there's still, I think, oftentimes you can sense that it does one thing far more than other, at least as you see it operating in history, right? And here you also have to kind of detach, I think, the intent, right? Some people have looked to these minstrels, these early minstrels, and say, "Oh, these folks were not racist. These folks did not plan to, like, and that's right. That's beside the point. The point is ultimately what it does, the impression it has, how it operates, or as kind of
Mhm.
we say in cultural history, the work it does, the cultural work it performs. And so mostly, or right, given the preponderance of evidence we have, what does it do more? And I agree that ultimately it's pretty clear that blackface minstrelsy, the work it does far more than um, some kind of fighting song of the working class against the elites. It's the fighting song of white Americans against black Americans.
And it's sort of like it felt you're going back to Edmund Morgan on some level with that because there are some Southern historians who are like making the claim like, no, race isn't that important, class is more important, and
hmm
you're kind of signaling in at least that what I felt that when I read your books that the closer members of, say, the same class but different racial backgrounds are, the more they see the differences between each other rather than the
hmm
similarities that the class
hmm
gives.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that from what I've seen, that's just seems to be the unfortunate truth, and the hard
Mhm.
truth is that people who are in close conditions and are
Mhm.
viewing themselves as competing with each other in some way, even
Mhm.
as they become to some degree culturally similar, they actually highlight the differences between them all the more, and seem to cherish those all the more. And so you actually find in places like, say, New York City, where lower class white people and lower class black people are living in close
Mhm.
confines with each other, to some degree there is some cultural commonalities that develop amongst them, and there's cross-cultural pollination, of course, as well, that happens. And a lot of popular music that we have today comes from that cross-cultural pollination between Irish
Mhm.
folk music and African folk music, and as it kind of emerged over in those type of settings. But it doesn't mean that it was some kind of sentimental, right, kumbaya moment. It was actually a very violent
Mhm.
environment, in which there was a lot of far more hostility um, than there was love, or right, sympathy. And here too, I think it's important to note that it's when you talk about working class people and why they develop that, it's not because they're kind of more racist by nature than, say, middle class people or anything like that. It's just because they're more anxious. These people
Mhm.
are closer by. It's pretty clear, for example, in American history, whenever middle class Americans had black people get too close to them, they got just as racist,
Mhm.
um, right? As there's a famous Phil Oakes song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal," where he
Mhm.
said, where he has this famous line, "So long as they don't live next door," right?
Mhm.
I'm all about integration, so long as they don't live next door.
Mhm.
Um, if the integration is between lower class white folks and black folks, I'm happy to have that happen. But and right, so
Don't
I
come
think
into
that
my school
there's
district.
right. So I think that there's a lot of that, a lot going on. So that's the unfortunate nature of class stratification. People try to differentiate themselves from the people underneath them because they're anxious about those people. They're anxious about um, what might happen with mixture with them. They're anxious about the fact that these people will take their jobs. They're anxious about all these type of things. And these people tend to be right. And so upper class people tend to be more anxious about lower class white people, and lower class white people tend to be more anxious about the rungs underneath them. Um, and so, and what's also interesting is what happens is that middle class folk, an attempt to separate themselves from lower class folks, they condescend at them by embracing, or sympathizing with kind of black Americans in casting lower class white folks as racist, right? Which I think is also a dynamic that operates here, that I thought that tried to flesh out to some degree, and tried to suggest that it's, again, more of a structural type of behavior as opposed to some kind of essentialist analysis of American culture. That's at least what I was hoping to go for.
The other thing that I kind of picked up on, and maybe that's just how I read it or looked at it, but you had a couple of images in sort of the chapters related to African American jokes and trickster and clown,
Hmm.
uh, and there were at least two of them where sort of you see these black individuals in uniform with hats, and
Hmm.
it sort of reminded me a little bit of the Haitian Revolution and its
Hmm.
leaders, and I kind of wondered, did that have an impact on the way people look
Hmm.
at Africans, like how they kind of, again, there's a lot of theatrics of
Hmm.
violence in the Haitian Revolution, so I kind of wondered how that
Hmm.
impacted others there.
Yeah, there's clear impact, I think, with the influence. I mean, these type of documents are usually the abolition broadsides, right? Um, these are usually cheaply printed broadsides, that are make fun of black people in their attempt to celebrate freedom in
Mhm.
the United States. There were freedom parades that happened when they marked the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade once a year in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And so these broadsides mocked their attempt to
Mhm.
have these parades. And these parades, when black people, when the black community was holding these type of parades, it was their kind of mainstay of asserting themselves as fully fledged members of the national of the United States, of the national community, asserting, kind of defining their freedom on their terms. And for white Americans, of course, they lambasted that and tried to make fun, and denigrate Black Americans in their spectacle of freedom and their spectacle. Um, and of course, it was happening in the early 1800s, in the recent wake of the Asian Revolution. The Asian Revolution was the ultimate case in which Black men became, or Black people became free, and held parades. And so it's, there's certainly a lot of influence of that type of imagery. I don't know exactly how that imagery came to be, right? These printers created these images, and these images often circulated because they had them already in store, and they had a few kind of blueprints in store that they used often. And I'm not sure how kind of the first ones were created or what they were influenced by, but it's pretty clear that to some degree they're influenced by the Haitian Revolution, or at least that's some kind of subtext. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I mean, we can't know everything in that
Right. Right.
case, and that,
Right.
like you said, and yes, I think you put it in a note on the images too, or in the text that the reuse happened quite a bit.
Right.
So
Hmm. Right.
it continues. So at this stage, we have talked for almost an hour and a half. So uh, we have given people hopefully a really good impression of what your book's about. But just out of curiosity, what was the most interesting thing that for you when you wrote the book? Which part, which story, which kind of research moment did you enjoy the most in the?
Um, I think, but I really enjoyed this. People often say that they really enjoy kind of this moment in the archive when they find something really valuable, that nobody else found. Historians love those moments, and I have to admit that I enjoyed one of those when I found this song that nobody used,
Mhm,
that I've seen nobody talk about, and I think it's an extraordinarily important song in American history, and it's one of the first black dialect songs that
mhm,
were created in the United States. It was a song. It's called "The Guinea Boy."
mhm,
It's a song that celebrates, or it's a song that was written after the Battle of New Orleans, that celebrates the Battle of New Orleans, and it's kind of part of that nationalist diffusion in the wake of the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812. But what's fascinating there is that it uses this genre of black dialect that will in time become blackface minstrelsy, and really showcases the way in which this genre from the very beginning was an extremely nationalist genre, that right racially nationalist genre that um, defined the nation racially, and that it comes out of the War of 1812. And so that's just finding that song and seeing it kind of, and realizing that nobody has found this song before, and it's just really striking, and very clear. It's kind of the smoking gun of sorts that I was looking for, and so that was pretty cool. Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I remember that. That was an interesting section. I think it's at the start of one of your chapters.
Right. In the introduction to part three, I discuss that song, and then I bring it in later in that chapter as well.
Yeah. No, it's as I said earlier, it's a really fascinating book, and the way you kind of envision the history of the United States there for those 100 years was just um yeah, it was a mirror that went up and kind of forcing people to think about um, the dark underside and humor that we laugh at, or they laughed at, I should say.
Mhm.
We shouldn't laugh
Yeah.
at. They did.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I hope it's kind of a sobering type of,
Mhm.
kind of story that that will kind of people will be able to um, learn from a little bit. That's the hope of every historian, I suppose. So, no different.
Well, at this stage, thank you so much, Around, for taking so much of uh, your Friday a morning to chat with me about your book. And um, real quick, for our audience who's interested in getting the book, it's American Laughter, American Fury: Humor and the Making of a White Man's Democracy, from Johns Hopkins Press.
There's also an audiobook that weirdly is cheaper.
Ooh.
So if you're into audiobooks and if you're into paying less, that's an option.
Great.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks so much for having me. It was great. I can talk forever about my book. It feels like, in that regard, I'm just a typical academic.
I know, and you have so much in it.
Thank you.